Last year, I made a video about how the mainstream media was screwing up the reporting on a nuclear fusion breakthrough, and in that video, I referenced Sabine Hossenfelder, a theoretical physicist with a very popular and often entertaining YouTube channel in which she goes over science news. A lot of physics stuff, but she also covers other fields, and other tech news as it arises. And when I made that reference, I had already seen some of her videos, but I honestly don't watch everything that I sub to. So I went through her channel and I scanned through her videos to make sure that she was staying more or less, scientifically accurate as far as I could tell. And most importantly, not being problematic about social issues. Because, the stereotype of an older physicist turning into a giant crank about topics outside of their field, it's not entirely without merit. No one is going to be right about everything all the time, but I don't want to accidentally promote someone who turns out to, mindlessly parrot transphobic talking points or something, right? Sabine Hossenfelder and TERFs read the subject line of an email I got from a viewer named Daniel a few days ago. And oh dear, I thought as I opened it up. Daniel explained that Hossenfelder's latest video was titled, "Is Being Trans a Social Fad Among Teenagers?" And Daniel was wondering whether that seemed just a bit TERFy. TERF, of course, stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. And that's a craze that's really taken off over in England and elsewhere, though here in America, our transphobes tend to not pretend to be feminists. They hate all of us, cis women and trans people alike. And generally, you can recognize a TERF because, they're cis people who, for some reason, just simply cannot stop talking and thinking about and worrying about and hating trans people. I'm not talking about people who have measured disagreements about things like, should we have clubs specifically for cis women, or do trans women who went through puberty before transitioning have an unfair advantage against cis women in professional sports, something I believe I saw Hossenfelder talk about, but it seemed pretty measured. But no, I'm talking about people who believe that any gender-affirming care, like using a child's preferred pronouns, is child abuse, and that, even adults shouldn't be able to transition safely. That's TERFs. People like Graham Linehan, for example, who TERFed so hard that his wife divorced him. If you want more examples, go ahead and scroll down beneath this video. There'll be the people absolutely losing their minds. Actually, and on that note, allow me to address something that happens every time I make a video talking about trans issues. Inevitably, some hardcore transphobes will show up and comment that I myself am a trans woman. And the comment makes it obvious that they think that this is an epic burn. Friends, I need you to know something. I don't think it's an insult to be trans. Because I know a lot of trans women, and I know that they have all kinds of different appearances, including some being way hotter and way more traditionally feminine than me. So you, the person making the comment, you're the one who thinks that it's an insult, not me. That's why it doesn't work as an effective insult. It would be like me calling you a fascist. I think of that as an insult, but you think of it as a perfectly legitimate political position, so it just doesn't work. I hope that this helps you craft some better insults for today's video. Thank you. Moving on, let's talk about what Hossenfelder actually said in her video. And I got to say, she didn't get off to a great start.
Should transgender teens transition? This rather personal question occupies a prominent place in the American culture war. On the one side, you have people claiming that it's a socially contagious fad among the brainwashed woke who want to mutilate your innocent children. On the other side, there are those saying that it's saving the lives of minorities who've been forced to stay in the closet for too long. And then there are normal people like you and I who think both sides are crazy, and could someone please summarize the facts in simple words, which is what I'm here for.
The normal centrist has entered the chat. Excellent. So sorry to stop her so quickly into her video, but I guess since I am solidly on one of those crazy sides she mentions, I just wanted to address it first and foremost. We're saying that allowing transgender teens to transition, which I think she means get gender affirming care, is saving lives. And yeah, it is. Association of Gender Affirming Hormone Therapy with Depression, Thoughts of Suicide, and Attempted Suicide Among Transgender and Non-Binary Youth, published in the Journal of Adolescent Health in April of 2022, found that the use of gender affirming hormone therapy was associated with lower odds of recent depression and seriously considering suicide compared to those who wanted therapy but did not receive it. For youth under age 18, therapy was associated with lower odds of recent depression and of a past year's suicide attempt. Mental health outcomes in transgender and non-binary youths receiving gender-affirming care, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Open Network in February of 2022, found that in 104 trans and non-binary youths aged 13 to 20 years, receipt of gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormones, was associated with 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality over a 12-month follow-up. Pubertal suppression for transgender youth and risk of suicidal ideation, published in Pediatrics in 2020, found a significant inverse association between treatment with pubertal suppression during adolescence and lifetime suicidal ideation among transgender adults who ever wanted this treatment. These results align with past literature suggesting that pubertal suppression for transgender adolescents who want this treatment is associated with favorable mental health outcomes. Psychological profile of the first sample of transgender youth presenting for medical intervention in a U.S. pediatric gender center, published in 2017 in the American Psychological Association's Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, found that older trans and non-binary youth seeking medical intervention experience poorer self-confidence, higher levels of anxiety, and decreased happiness and satisfaction than the younger patients. The results provide further evidence of the resiliency of a significant number of transgender youth, as well as the severity of mental health concerns for others. New to the existing literature are the results showing older transgender teenagers as more distressed, supporting the clinical recommendation to consider earlier medical intervention for appropriate youth and to always incorporate mental health support and assessment. Okay, I'll stop there. That was just a really quick search of the literature. The evidence is overwhelming. Gender-affirming care, which includes the use of puberty blockers sometimes, and even more importantly, hormone therapy, most likely prevents suicides. You can disagree with those studies if you'd like, even if you're just a physicist, but is it fair to call those researchers and the people who accept this preponderance of findings, this consensus, crazy? I don't know. Hossenfelder's opening statement is akin to saying, on the one side, we have people who think vaccines are a way for Bill Gates to inject us with microtransmitters, and on the other side are people who think vaccines are safe and effective ways to reduce the spread of disease. And then there are normal people like you and I who think both sides are crazy and could simply use someone to summarize the facts, which is, what I'm here for. This is known as false balance or both sidesism, a rhetorical trick that pretends to demonstrate an unbiased viewpoint, but in reality, you are being biased by default by comparing something backed up by reams of scientific data with something that has no basis in reality. You're equating those two things when they are not, in fact, equal. While it's a terrible and fallacious start, the whole video, I have to say, isn't that bad, luckily. She does, for instance, correctly state that transgender people have been around for ages, that many cultures accept and codify the existence of a third gender, and that transgender people today are very much stigmatized. She goes on to say, though, that the number of children expressing gender dysmorphia is higher than the number of adults, which she calls puzzling. She refers to rapid onset of gender dysphoria, the idea that kids just decide to become trans randomly and quickly one day based on their friends and internet memes. And again, here we have false balance. She correctly states that the term was popularized by a paper written by Dr. Lisa Littman that was controversial as it only described the opinions of parents of transgender kids, and those parents were all found on forums for people who don't think transgender people exist. Also, not all of the people surveyed could even be verified to have any transgender kids. She says that this paper was criticized for not being a real study, but just surveys. And that is a ridiculous summary. People don't have trouble with surveys. Surveys are part of doing science. This paper was framed by the author as describing a real scientifically supported phenomenon, a framing so dishonest that PLOS ONE had to issue an apology along with a major rewriting of the entire paper to make it clear that these surveys were used to develop a hypothesis that rapid onset of gender dysphoria is real, but not actually test that hypothesis. Hossenfelder goes on to correctly note that a follow-up paper found no evidence for the existence of rapid onset of gender dysphoria. But she says that that study was also criticized because some of the survey questions were vague. So she sums up that
the brief summary of this controversy is that at the moment, there is no conclusive evidence neither for nor against the existence of rapid onset gender dysphoria, though it seems to be supported by anecdotal reports from doctors working in clinics who treat the children.
This is a stunning example of false balance. First of all, in science, if there is no evidence for a hypothesis, then we cannot put any stock in that hypothesis, period. Doesn't matter if someone was critical of the study design of something else that found no evidence. Where is the study that did find the evidence? There isn't one? Then we can safely dismiss that hypothesis until there is one. One side says the Easter Bunny exists with a survey of 4-year-olds who all say the Easter Bunny exists. The other side conducted a survey of actual rabbits and found none with the ability to lay eggs. But many are critical of the author's use of Bayesian inference, so at this point, we just really can't say one way or the other about the existence of the Easter Bunny. No, we need a study first, showing evidence for the hypothesis. But this particular line is not just false balance, because then Hossenfelder goes on to put her thumb on the scale by saying, though rapid onset of gender dysphoria seems to be supported by doctors working in clinics that treat the children. Excuse me? Like, citation? She just throws this line out there with zero evidence, leaving the average viewer to say, oh, no real evidence either way, but if doctors think it's real, I guess it must be real. No. As far as I can tell, there's absolutely no evidence that rapid onset of gender dysphoria is anything other than a boogeyman made up by transphobes obsessing about trans people online. And maybe Hossenfelder does have a citation for this. Maybe I've just missed all of the doctors who are saying that this is a real phenomenon. But I couldn't find that citation, and more on that in a second. But first, back to some of the not terrible stuff. Hossenfelder gives what appears to me to be a pretty accurate overview of the ideal gender-affirming care timeline, which is, a child can change their name or choose new pronouns around age 10 or so. They can choose to go on puberty blockers if they'd like to have more time to consider whether or not they would like to transition. By 15, they can start taking cross-sex hormones. And then as an adult, if they would like, they can decide if they would like to have surgical procedures. She goes on to say that side effects of puberty blockers include things like bone density loss, and she says that it's irreversible, which is a pretty unnuanced take, and dare I say, maybe even an untrue take. As I said in a previous video on this topic, researchers are still looking into whether bone density loss is actually a problem, how serious it is if it is a problem, and then whether or not your body readjusts when you stop taking the puberty blockers. Though a 2019 systematic review did find that while these blockers slow mineral accrual, after discontinuation, bone density appears not to be significantly different from that of their peers by late adolescence. Reports of BMD among children and adolescents verified a decrement in BMD at the achievement of near AH, while accrual resumed after therapy, regardless of whether or not calcium supplementation was given. By late adolescence, all subjects had BMD within the normal range. She then says puberty blockers might increase the risk of heart problems, though none of those studies are particularly conclusive due to a small sample size. And I had actually never heard this one. So again, I went looking for the citation. And I realized that, like me, she includes her references with the transcript over on her Patreon. But unlike me, she hides those behind a paywall. Being unwilling to part with my precious $2.50, I searched for any studies looking at heart problems in kids on puberty blockers, but I was only able to find data about hormones and cardiovascular issues. I did find someone who points out that they think Hossenfelder might be talking about studies that suggest that older men treated for prostate cancer with GnRH analogs as a testosterone blocker may show an increase in heart problems, which that seems to be like more than just a small sample size. But again, I might be missing out on the citations. They're behind a paywall. I'm sorry. Hossenfelder goes on to downplay the huge number of studies that show an obvious benefit in mental health for those kids who are able to get gender-affirming care. She reduces it to just the use of puberty blockers as opposed to, the entire support system that a trans kid deserves and needs, like a supportive community of family, friends, school officials, government officials who don't ban all the books about trans people from the local library. But even with the absolute basics of mental health resources and puberty blockers, plus the option to go on hormones, the evidence is simply overwhelming, but Hossenfelder dismisses them for often having a lack of a control group. She does address one of these studies I mentioned earlier, the one that showed a 73% reduction in suicidality, but she dismisses it for two reasons. First, because she points out that the mental health of the kids in treatment didn't improve so much as the mental health of the kids who didn't get treatment was way worse. It declined significantly. Sabine, we call that a control group. You were literally just complaining about the lack of a control group in other studies. That's a control group. And that is a valid result. Kids who don't get this treatment, their mental health goes all to shit. The kids that do get the treatment maintain their mental health. That's good. That's evidence of good in that treatment. The second reason she dismisses it, she circles this on the screen to point out that the untreated control group at the end of the study consisted of only 7 people, which is a very small number. And also this is super disingenuous because the researchers noted that depressive symptoms and suicidality were 2-fold to 3-fold higher than baseline levels at 3 and 6 months of follow-up as well, not just at the end of the study. And those groups had 38 and 24 people respectively. Out of 108 total subjects, that's a perfectly valid amount for a control group that is obviously going to get progressively smaller as the study goes on and as more of those kids finally enter into care. But hey, that's just a little evidence in favor of my hypothesis as opposed to the zero evidence in favor of rapid onset of gender dysphoria, so I can see why she thinks I'm crazy for being swayed by the former and not the latter. She wraps up by saying this.
Just exactly what is going on, no one really knows, but the reasonable expectation is that the current increase in reports of gender dysphoria is caused by a mixture of 2 causes. Young people are more comfortable being openly trans, and some of them erroneously believe they are trans because they've heard so much about it. I'd say that anyone who insists that one of those possibilities doesn't exist is pushing an agenda and shouldn't be taken seriously.
Now, as bad as her both sides be crazy introduction was, I did at least have a little respect that Hossenfelder didn't straw man my beliefs, as I really do think that the evidence shows that gender-affirming care is, quote, saving the lives of minorities who've been forced to stay in the closet for too long. But now she's ending with a complete straw man. I've never argued and would never argue that there aren't kids out there who think they might be trans but aren't. And I'm not aware of anyone who has argued that, and she doesn't present any evidence of that. But it's a big world out there. I bet somebody has. While Hossenfelder has presented no evidence of anyone saying that, she's also provided no evidence that these hypothetical mixed up kids are managing to get themselves on puberty blockers or then cross-sex hormones or then surgery without being properly vetted by doctors. Let alone the idea that they're being pushed into this by enthusiastic doctors. There's certainly wiggle room to debate the relative seriousness of the side effects of certain medications and whether it's worth it and what the best timeline looks like to protect the mental and physical health of patients. But here, Hossenfelder asserts, or at least implies, something that has no evidence at all, that a significant population of kids falsely believe that they're trans because they've heard so much about it and are taking dangerous, irreversible drugs because of that. There's no evidence for that at all. There's only evidence of doctors who are working together with patients and their families to determine the healthiest path forward, all while dodging the roadblocks thrown out by transphobic legislation and, of course, our piss-poor healthcare industry. All right, this has been exhausting for everyone involved, I'm sure, so I'm just going to wrap it up with this. Do I think Hossenfelder is a TERF or transphobe? Labels can be useful, and if it's useful for you to put that label on her and avoid all of her content going forward, that's up to you. But people can be complicated. So I'm just going to say that whether or not she meant to, she repeatedly used a misleading rhetorical device to elevate transphobic talking points to the same level as scientific evidence. And she did that in front of a very large audience. That would be bad enough for any topic, but in this case, she did it with a topic that is related to politicians drastically ruining people's lives here in the United States. Banning kids from even learning about trans people, banning books that mention them, requiring children's genitals to be inspected before they're allowed to play school sports, stopping people from being able to change their identification to be more accurate, rolling back non-discrimination laws so employers, businesses, and even hospitals can turn away trans people, censoring drag performances, blocking insurance from covering trans-related health care, forcing teachers to out their trans students to their families, and so much more. I'm sure Hossenfelder would say she finds most, if not all of those things abhorrent, but her video misrepresents the data in the same ways many of the proponents of those bills do, and her lack of nuance convinces the average viewer that this side of the debate is worth listening to. It actually reminds me of the problem with the New York Times I talked about a little while ago, where the editors might be against this sort of legislation, but their words are being cited in the bills used to draft this legislation. You're going to be taken out of context, and you need to be aware of that in a situation like this. So sadly, videos like this are dangerous to trans kids, to trans adults, and even to cis people who would prefer to not have their gender performance policed or their genitals examined just to be able to use a public bathroom. In a time like this, we need more nuance, more compassion, and more scientific precision, not less. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.